Jingle everyone. My name's Oliver Costello. I'm a Bundjalung man from Northern Rivers, New South Wales. And firstly, I'd just like to start by acknowledging country and paying my respects to elders past, present and future, both here on the Widjil Bible lands of the Bundjalung Nation and all the lands where everybody else is listening in from today. So, yeah, for me, it's really important to always acknowledge country and support the really important aspirations of our ancestors to look after country and continue to follow their guidance as we go forward to support looking after country. And thanks. So moving on. So we also want to acknowledge the over 60 participants who contributed to the research and the participants at the workshops and all the government and non-government agencies who supported the project.
Yeah, and just to say hello as well, I'm Kathy Robinson. I've been co-leading this with Ollie. I just wanted to particularly acknowledge the traditional owners, Indigenous rangers, their support crews who really did contribute to this research. This is pretty poignant because, you know, everyone's just recovering from bushfires and still going to be for some time. And yet everyone was just so generous with their time. So just wanted to acknowledge that, particularly during COVID and everything else that's come our way. It really was a very generous community practice, so thank you.
I'd also like to acknowledge the other co-researchers, Stephen Garnett, Bettina Pert and Michelle Lockwood as well. And so today I guess we're going to go through the project, empowering Indigenous leadership and participation in bushfire recovery, cultural burning and land management.
Excellent.
So it's just started pouring rain here too.
Well, we can just we can dovetail if you like, Ollie. That's fine. So we're just going to give you an overview of a 6-month research project. If we're all in a room, we'd be encouraging a bit of a round table. So if you do have any comments or you know, questions you'd like to ask, feel free just to ask during this presentation. So just raise it, and if we see it or if Holly sees it, we just might alert to that and see if we can just answer that. It will give us plenty of time at the end because we know this discussion is, you know, worthwhile to have, and so we'll skip through the kind of key points. Quite a long report's coming your way in the next few weeks, which has all this in detail and some of the recommendations that we're going to be outlining today. So reach out if you have any questions, but we might just kick off if that's all right. So just note, it is only a 6-month research project, so it was a lot of work and a lot of generous time that was shared so that we could get as many perspectives as we could. We were limited by COVID, we couldn't do the on-ground workshops that we did, but we did do online yarns and lots of interviews and relied on some of the data that fabulous government agency representatives shared, as well as Indigenous and NGOs. So I guess it was conducted in response to calls from Indigenous people to lead and become far more closely involved in fire management in areas of southern and eastern Australia, particularly those areas affected by 2019-2020 bushfires. And pretty much the aim that we were given was to identify a series of long and short and long-term practical measures that can be implemented to enable Indigenous leadership in future fire management efforts. I guess the delays in this project and the lack of ability to go on ground has meant that we haven't been able to go from region to region and provide specifics for particular regions, but we have provided some pretty good evidence base and recommendations that have been supported by all. So here's a bit of research context and methods. So practical measures identified to enable Indigenous leadership in future fire management efforts really do draw on a multiple source of evidence. And I just wanted to highlight at this point too, it does build on the fantastic NESP community practice, which we're very grateful for all that support, from various NESPs actually that have looked at some of these questions both in Northern Australia and in Southern Australia. So this is actually part of the national snapshot that we've done. And so I think we've now got a pretty comprehensive view of where we could go next. The key to that is workshops and submissions that would be made through the various royal commissions and of course publicly available information. Those practical measures focus on aligning Indigenous aspirations with fire management needs, both before and after major events. We do want to acknowledge that this map only shows the bioregions snapshot that were affected by bushfires, And we also want to acknowledge that this doesn't cover species that are culturally significant, sites that were like cultural heritage sites. And so, in a way, we're given this map, but perhaps we could think about extending it if we start to think about biocultural landscapes and Indigenous nations. Over to you, Ollie.
Thanks, Kathy. So, yeah, fire is both a threat to and a healer of country, and I guess seeing some of the devastating impacts of the 2019-2020 season firsthand, not far from here, we had bushfires up in the rainforest and then sweeping all through the East Coast, as everyone's aware, is really devastating impacts. And I guess particularly devastating because we know that fire can be such an important healer of country through the appropriate application of fire, as our ancestors have done for thousands of years. So I guess seeing these bushfires and the impacts of these bushfires really highlights the importance, I guess, of recognising Indigenous knowledge and practice to be able to manage the threats of bushfires, but more importantly, burn for healthy country. So applying the right fire that's stimulating those important ecosystems and cultural kind of values responses. And so I guess as everyone's pretty well aware, fire that are too frequent or too infrequent, too intense or too extensive, are posing major threats to significant sites and species, both threatened and culturally significant species. So it's really important that we understand those fire regimes and how we can manage them better. And at the same time, we've got Indigenous land and fire management practitioners emphasising the critical importance of fire management for biodiversity and cultural health, and even beyond the ecosystem story, like the importance for people's cultural identity and practice, and how important it is for people to be on country burning. And there's a little photo here of some of the burning we've been doing up at Dunoon on the Durrabee Grass Reserve with Widjabul people, and just such an important kind of demonstration of people coming together, on these culturally significant places to be able to burn and share knowledge together.
Okay, well, I might just keep going while Ollie does the tech, if that's okay. So from us scouring through the various data sets that are available, we started to have a little, snapshot of what were the impacts of 2019, 2020 bushfires on Indigenous people and Indigenous country. And this relied on a whole range of sources. But it was interesting just to do a snapshot, for example, of the impact on Indigenous lands and IPAs, where you could see some of those areas that were burnt. Included areas where Indigenous protected areas were done. Some of the interviews that we did as well, though, and from Indigenous and non-Indigenous practitioners, highlighted that where there had been cultural burning, there was actually less severe impact. And this was going on across the bushfire regions. So it was really fascinating to see, although that area was burnt, in many, many areas where there had been some cultural burning, there was certainly less severe impact. And some of that's been reported, of course, in some of the public forums. Ollie, did you want to add anything?
No, I think I'm just trying to get my. No, I think that's. I guess. So I was totally tuned out for a second. I guess just the important thing to note is that like there's very small representation of Indigenous controlled lands in the southern parts of Australia. And so there's a significant, and it's all traditionally Aboriginal lands, I should note, and sovereignty was never ceded. But I guess it's important to note that we're seeing a few little pickups of different IPAs, but it's not, I guess, representative of the amount of country and communities that have been impacted. So yeah, that's the only point I wanted to make. Yep.
Thank you. I'll let you take over now, Ollie.
Yep. All right. So. Yeah, I might read this one because some people haven't probably got it yet. After a large natural disaster, the country is silent. The whispering you hear from the winds reminds you of obligations and responsibilities to country, and there is trauma because we are not always sure if country can respond and heal. This goes to people's heart. It is hard to stay in tune with severely burnt landscapes. This is very different to the trauma of losing material possessions. It can take a lifetime to heal. That was a quote from one of the interviewees from the Federation of Victorian Traditional Owner Corporation. Sorry, mouthful there. And this sentiment, it was shared by many people throughout. Straight after the bushfires had been through bits of country, I was spending time with different knowledge holders and traditional owners, and people were just, you know, traumatized by what's happened. And but, you know, seeing trees that, you know, being there pre-colonization, 200, 300-year-old trees, you know, die, and knowing that, you know, like things, you know, there's going to be regeneration, seeds are going to sprout and things are going to grow, but knowing that it's going to take hundreds of years for some of these species to recover and, you know, return to their previous dominance in the landscape. And sadly, I think we're going to lose many from places and many from the landscape as well. So it's really hard. It's a really devastating impact, because yeah, we can rebuild fences and houses, and, you know, and obviously you know, you can't rebuild all of these landscapes in, you know, within these time periods. So it's really hard for some people, particularly traditional owners who have these, you know, enduring connections to country and have been devastated by these fires.
Yeah, and again, we really appreciate those who did share these stories. It was often a very heart-wrenching, you know, conversation and interview, but we're really grateful, and just repeat that gratefulness of people just sharing. But some of that enduring and holistic nature of that trauma was pretty evident.
So another really, I guess, devastating impact around significant species was the impacts on Burrabi, or Burrabi. In Bundjalung, we call koalas. And Burrabi belong to Waybar Jagun. They belong to fire country. And we, as we can see from those that can see the PowerPoint, you know, there was really extensive impacts on koala country. You know, in New South Wales, it affected 10%. So, you know, in others like ACT, 36%. So huge impacts on koala habitat. And I guess these kind of events really, I guess, highlight an opportunity for learning, because there's, I guess, in my work in this space, I've seen a lot of apprehension, a lot of people concerned about burning because of koalas. And I guess this really highlights the fact that if you don't burn country the right way for healthy country, if you don't burn, you know, put in the cultural burns, low intensity burns to manage the health of the country and protect the canopy, you know, you end up with this alternative reality where you end up with huge canopy fires and huge losses of koalas and their habitat. And so, yeah, I think it's really important we understand the significance of these impacts, and also that koalas are quite iconic, and, you know, a lot of people are aware of koalas and quite sympathetic to their cause, but there's many other species out there that are both threatened and culturally significant that people are unaware of the impacts. And so it's really important that we understand that there's been so many impacts on a whole heap of different plants and animals and places, and particularly from a cultural point of view, you know, some species aren't seen as that important in a local area, but for local people, they may be their key totem or their key food resource. So there's huge parts of the landscape where people's species of value, significant species, have been so significantly impacted. And as you can see, you know, all across the coast, the koalas have been devastated by these fires.
And thank you, Ollie. And for those who've just got the email, this is slide 8, just so you can catch up. But I guess we're just making this point of, we just did a little dive into the koalas just to make that, it came up in the interviews of culturally significant species, cultural heritage sites that really need to be thought through when we start to think about bushfire recovery plans, preparing and recovery. So how do we start to think about the mechanisms by which Indigenous leadership can be enabled through that process, not only in decision making, but species, sites and landscapes that we should be prioritising.
And there's lots of communities that are really keen, or already are quite active in managing their significant species and koalas. And so being able to look at ways to support them, you know, post-fire recovery, monitoring, getting out and starting to do that fire and other cultural landscape planning to be able to help protect the habitat that's left and protect the populations that are left, and help manage for future impacts that are highly likely to occur in the future. So we're up to...
So once we've done the interviews and the workshops, and we trawled through every submission that has been done around the bushfires, we basically just identified the key issues, both in terms of that hinder Indigenous cultural burning and bushfire recovery, and also some of the opportunities where there's, you know, some real innovation going on. So in summary, and we'll go through, the report goes this into detail, so you'll get that in a few weeks. But I guess in summary, there was a couple of key issues that were identified. Inadequate decision-making resourcing was really from ground to policy. And some of that was about enabling on both sides. So there was just ways about how do we connect better so that we can empower Indigenous people to be involved in the decision-making in the preparation in terms of and land management efforts, as well as a very quick speed, highly technical and highly regulated bushfire recovery. So part of this was, working to do this better was a key area. You could see some great innovations going on around the country, but there was definitely a need to start to think about that so that it was consistent across the states. The second area was the current regulatory and legal frameworks. Some of this is, of course, as Ollie said, gee whiz, the Indigenous groups across Southern Australia are just doing fantastic cross-tenure arrangements. But you could see very different arrangements and very different cultures working between tenures. So there was a call for, this need for kind of tenure blind arrangements so that there was a bit of consistency across those areas. Regulatory and legal frameworks included things like insurance so that groups could actually work, so that they were safe, as well as in which the training arrangements are so that it can also include cultural protocols as well as formal file ones. The third area is about disconnection with and lack of access to country. So there was definitely a need identified to start to how do we, support culturally appropriate ways of, reigniting groups, reigniting knowledge, so that everyone can start to burn in an appropriate way in contemporary landscape settings. Fourth was about conflicting views about fire. So definitely there was this asset risk, which was understandable in terms of protecting assets, to cultural burning, which was more holistic, Indigenous-led. And so some of that conflict was not only between Indigenous and non-Indigenous fire practitioners, but actually between non-Indigenous fire practitioners between different agencies. So across tenures, this isn't just a question for reconciliation. It's also a question of consistency across tenures and across fire practitioners. Fragmented partnerships and burning regimes, of course, all connected here, but some of this is about where groups have had to start to negotiate piecemeal arrangements between non-Indigenous partners. And sometimes those arrangements are quite different, even within one region. So while they might have more of a collaborative arrangement with one particular partner, the other partner will, insist on very restricted fire service agreements only under that non-Indigenous term. So encouraging sort of more of a regional approach between tenures and stakeholders has been identified. And we thought this is a good quote to identify from a country fire service officer from South Australia, that historical experience that creates the attitudes that we have for fire today is important. This is for Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners. Indigenous people keep telling us that how they feel excluded and denied access. And non-Indigenous people need to build trust and cultural understanding about how this history affects attitudes to each other and the trust you need to collaborate to burn. Ollie, are you happy if I continue?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Just one thing that I guess note is that, there has been some good progress over the last sort of 5 or 10 years at trying to look at some of these key sort of challenges, but some are still really embedded. And hopefully, I guess, these recent bushfires have really highlighted some of these hindering factors, and I guess I'm hoping that we'll be able to push through some of them. There's some quite complex ones, but there is some good progress, and I guess hopefully we can build that space.
Going on for the last decade or so, and there's an extraordinary amount of capability out there. There's an extraordinary amount of innovative partnerships going on, and so I guess we just lifted some thank you to the Merit team from DOR, and thank you to those who shared that data, was just to actually have a look at all the groups that are out there in that fire burning region that are actively involved in Indigenous land management and cultural burning. Now, some of that might be just early stages and others are a lot more mature, but it does highlight we've got a fair bit of capacity to go on there. So I guess that empowering is that cultural burning contemporary landscapes has been working. It's been adapting to fit the tenure and to fit the new fire conditions that it's working with, and the capacity of partners to collaborate. It's been building on those existing land and fire management partnerships and activities, and recognising local Indigenous rights, knowledge and cultural authority in very different ways, but there's a lot of learning that's available between groups if we can build on that capacity. Empowering women was really highlighted again and again, so that we can make sure that women are empowered as Indigenous land and fire managers, but also so cultural sites that are gendered and cultural practices are supported. There's been some fantastic ways in which fire knowledge has been shared, rejuvenated and built. Peer-to-peer networks have arrived and started to mature and started to support groups who are just starting or curious to know which pathways forward and how to go ahead. Healing country through adaptive local burning has been experimental. It's gone from voluntary arrangements where it's just started and partners start to work to. It's had service agreements where Indigenous fire crews and land management crews are brought in by a fire management partner for a fee-for-service arrangement, to those under more joint management arrangements where they can start to really lead why, where and how fire should be done in particular landscapes. Again and again, though, we kept hearing about this consistency of that fire now in contemporary landscapes and empowering Indigenous burning and land management practices is really part of a broader collaboration and reconciliation. Collaboration between Indigenous partners and non-Indigenous partners across tenures, and also reconciliation that recognises that the history, is still a legacy that we have to work with today when we do these practices and needs to inform our future directions. In very operational terms, some training, funding, insurance, employment kept coming up again and again. And people have really got some great ideas and great examples of how they've made that work. Ollie, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. I really like this thing to highlight the importance of that recognition of country as an empowering process and recognition of people's rights and the respect that comes with that. And then I guess the responsibilities that we share. And so I think, you can see that there's some really great work that's been going on to empower. But there's, I guess, as I said before, there's these hindering processes, and we really need to try and use those empowering processes to overcome. Without getting into the recommendations, I think I'll hand it over to the next one. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I've just divided the recommendations into three key thematics here, and we'll just give you a snapshot of them, but of course they form our conclusion, so dive in for bedtime reading later. But those recommendations are in three core areas. So empowering Indigenous rights and authority, supporting collaboration and reconciliation, empowering Indigenous rights and authority to care for country through fire. So we'll just go through some of those short and high recommendations, noting we just need some time for questions and discussion, and more than happy to talk about these later.
So firstly, we had empower Indigenous rights and authority. Short-term recommendations were support and resource local elders. Being able to support communities to be able to practice and revitalise their knowledge is the key pathway. Elders, youth, being able to transfer knowledge and pass on that knowledge and practice is critical. Resourcing groups to be able to apply their own culturally appropriate monitoring evaluation frameworks. So being able to demonstrate the benefits, through practice, and communities being able to take, I guess, some control over it, instead of it always being this kind of reporting back and, giving over, I guess, data. We need to better support people to be able to collect their own data and share what they want to share, demonstrate the benefits, instead of always trying to be, I guess, validating other people's wishes. Providing legal protection and insurance. This is a really critical issue. Most of the fire management that happens in the landscape is done through state and territory land management organisations that have legal protections in legislation and really complex risk management frameworks that give them those protections, which means that it makes it really hard for landholders and Indigenous fire practitioners to be able to operate and to be able to provide the kind of assurances that are required in a modern kind of legal and monetary economy. So yeah, trying to deal with that legal protection insurance space is really critical, so that we can get more, the irony is that it's harder for people to burn low intensity, low risk activities. It's harder, which actually prevent and reduce impacts from bushfires, so than it is to do the alternative, than to let wildfires run and to see millions of dollars of assets and irreplaceable cultural and natural values destroyed. So we need to do something about that. Resourcing people to be able to participate in training and mentoring, as I said, that's a critical learning pathway. It's where so much of the growth has come in this space in the south through people being able to kind of network and grow, because a lot of these landscapes for a long time have really seen an absence of cultural fire. And so for a lot of communities, being able to kind of engage with other groups, share knowledge, practice that fire on other people's country and their own is a really critical pathway to build confidence and knowledge. And lastly, around simplifying incentives, creating new planning and procurement regulative requirements to enable cultural fire management through formal partnerships. This is really critical because it's about resourcing. There's a whole heap of different state and federal kind of frameworks that are about, whether it's joint management, Indigenous land use agreements, whether it's procurement policies. There's all these frameworks that are trying to sort of drive growth in Indigenous communities. But they struggle in lots of areas, and here's a really important area that we can try and simplify and I guess make more streamlined to be able to get more, cultural fire management, and also bushfire recovery response and a whole heap of different cultural land management services in place.
And so while there's been some great work in that long-term area, you can in the short term you can see areas where there's some real opportunities there and some lessons learned. But when we go into the longer term, you can see it starts to move up the kind of decision-making scales where there's some policy, regulative, and insurance barriers between groups and across tenures that really do make this challenging. So while we can work that on the operational level, there was a fair few suggestions across tenures and institutional arrangements that just make it a bit tricky for Indigenous people to be involved. Things like bushfire recovery decision-making processes, or when and why and how you start to burn and how do you engage Indigenous groups. The difficulties of finding traditional owners and engagement mechanisms that work for particular local contexts are all identified. We can come back to these at the end of this talk if we wish. I'm just conscious that it's great to have time for discussion.
Next one, supporting collaboration and reconciliation. So short-term recommendations were develop Indigenous engagement and collaborative strategies and protocols. So really drawing on these initiatives that are already in place, and building them, and I guess working in that sort of cross tenure and more inclusive frameworks. Next one was around resource Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners to build their capacity to support cultural burning objectives and activities, and negotiate agreed pathways to protect, share and acknowledge integrated knowledge and practice. It's really, really critical that there's protections and recognition of knowledge and practice so that we can share what's appropriate and support the growth and development of Indigenous-led frameworks. And lastly, targeting community and public education programs to increase awareness around the benefits and I guess enhancing appreciation of Aboriginal people or Indigenous people's rights and practices around caring for country. So I guess that's been one of the kind of, big outcomes of the bushfires, that there's so much interest in cultural fire management. It's really grown, and it's really important to, to continue to build on that awareness. As COVID's hit and all sorts of other things have hit, it's dropped off a bit, but there's so much more work that needs to be done in the bushfire recovery, but also in that future landscape and cultural land management space, that we can really build and harness a lot of energy going forward through really targeted, community and public education programs.
Thanks, Ollie. And I guess then in the long term is managing those operating procedures and actually identifying where can we really empower Indigenous and traditional owners in that preparation process, in the response and recovery phases of bushfire management. So there were some really interesting recommendations of why it wasn't working and where local groups found ways around to make that work. And so again, they're all in the report, but it shows it can work, but it seems to be working only in locals, spots around the landscape rather than as an established protocol. And the second one was really thinking about performance indicators to evaluate how well relevant agencies collaborate with Indigenous leaders, organisations and enterprises and people in bushfire management. I guess this was turning the evaluation on non-Indigenous partners and agencies so that we can actually keep track of that and find ways in which we can all learn and collaborate on this area.
Thanks, Kathy. And the last one was empower and support Indigenous-led bushfire planning and recovery. So critically, in the short term, we need to establish and resource decision-making roles for Indigenous leaders in recovery planning and strategies to ensure cultural values and IP and knowledge and priorities are protected, respected and valued. And so this emerged in some areas. You could see that because of existing relationships and projects that agencies were able to sort of draw on the capacity of, IPAs or rangers or, local land council crews, but fairly limited sort of, and this has been an ongoing issue for a long time in these jurisdictions, where there's really disjointed kind of decision-making and engagement frameworks in place in government generally. And so when it comes to engaging communities in that space, it can be quite, disjointed. So there's, I guess, a real opportunity to do better there and learn the mistakes. There's been so many areas impacted, and it's really fresh in the minds of decision makers in communities around how they might prefer to be engaged, and in a long-term process as well as a short-term process. The next one was around emergency disaster planning strategies are culturally appropriate. So just building on that process, being able to kind of get things in place when people are making decisions needs to happen before we get there. And so being able to get these disaster plans and other strategies, recovery plans kind of reviewed and implemented in a more culturally appropriate way is really critical. The next one was empower and resource local Indigenous leaders and staff in bushfire recovery efforts. So there's obviously devastating impacts, a lot of recovery work to be done. There's been quite substantial investment from the Commonwealth, the states, territories, and the community philanthropic. So there's investment there, and I think there just needs to be more coordination and better support for Indigenous leadership in that space around engaging Aboriginal Indigenous businesses, and also working within those culturally appropriate knowledge sets to be able to make sure that the impacts are understood from a cultural point of view, and we're implementing culturally appropriate measures. And the last one was around support and resource bushfire recovery policies and strategies to care for culturally significant species and habitats, and strengthen approach for establishing the significance of cultural heritage sites, and including those sites in bushfire management planning. So this is really critical. This has been a big issue for a long time. Building recognition of culturally significant species and habitats. So understanding that, like different groups, different Indigenous nations and peoples have different relationships to country, have different relationships to species, and they don't always fit with, state or territory kind of threatened species or other priorities. And so it's important that we understand what those local priorities are, because they are really important species and places, and also building on that heritage space as well. So, one of the really sad outcomes, I guess, or things that we see is that, huge areas of the country were devastated by fires. And when we have a look at those impacts on heritage, it's really hard to see from a data point of view what's happened in the heritage space, because there's huge gaps in those significant species and heritage data. So we really need to sort of strengthen frameworks around that, and I guess get really good planning in place. And there's a whole heap of different mechanisms that have worked quite well. So it's not starting from scratch. I guess it's just looking at what's working, what might work, and actually trying to get that in place and in the policies and strategies going forward. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Ollie. And I just want to acknowledge that this builds on what is going on. So it's been really impressive to see what the states have been up to and various agencies have been up to. There's now, reconciliation action plans, support plans, strategies, Indigenous cultural burning strategies. There's some, fantastic funding that have been released to support more and more Indigenous groups to engage in this work. I guess what we found is when we went from the ground up in those conversations is keep going. There's some groups that are really charged on in this. There's a whole bunch of groups who are really keen to start and to build partnerships with their neighbours. And so I guess in that long term is starting to move that into, as Ollie's was talking about, is those kind of three dimensions. One is about the fire. So how do we start to, really empower Indigenous decision making and involvement in fire? Second part of that is the people. So how do we actually support Indigenous people to be trained, to be resourced, to be empowered to make those decisions? And the third, of course, is country. And so how do we think about, putting in culturally significant species into bushfire recovery plans? how do we think about threatened species recovery plans, thinking about cultural burning fire and supporting Indigenous knowledge. And so I guess part of that three-part triangle there of people, species and country being part of that was certainly circulating around all these recommendations. We're going to end now just so that we can all reflect on that and open it up for any questions. Just to note though, there is going to be a process now where we'll be sharing that report out to you all so you can have a look and also this presentation. And do reach out if you have any questions for either of us. Thanks, Holly.
Yes, thank you so much, Kathy and Ollie, for that really great presentation and all the recommendations that are very clearly laid out for short-term and long-term. I'd like to open it up to the floor to ask Ollie and Kathy any questions. So I guess maybe I'll ask you the first one then, while people are thinking. So has any of the organizations, your partners, picked up any of the recommendations yet, and have they kind of implemented any of these recommendations that you know of?
Well, there's perhaps two parts to this, if it's okay if I start, Ollie. I can't emphasise enough that this builds on recommendations that have been made before. So, you know, there shouldn't be anything totally surprising in these recommendations. The Northern Nest Hub supported a national forum from all the northern focus groups to talk about this. This hub has supported you know, some of the southern groups' discussions in the Royal Commissions and various inquiries. These comments have been made not just in the last 6 months. And so I just want to firstly acknowledge that. I think in second part of that acknowledgement is that it is impressive what local groups have done to make it work. It really is. You can see how local councils, NGOs, government agencies, fire services have started to work ways in which it works for the local context and establish really, you know, fit for purpose partnerships. I guess the key part of that though is if we, you know, you could draw a map around those and you would still see that patchiness. The patchiness of supporting just early cultural burning efforts and, you know, workshops and training. So you can see a lot of attention has been there, but then moving that along the spectrum of more maturity so that you can empower Indigenous leadership and you can support Indigenous on-country enterprises. That's where you see a severe drop-off, particularly in this southern region where bushfires area. So I guess the key message is here, keep going, but we need to move that spectrum from that early, you know, startups, you know, exploring, just starting to work out how to work together along the spectrum of that maturity so we can actually really empower. Holly, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I think, yeah, acknowledge that yeah, there is we're drawing from a lot of great work that's happening. And I guess, you know, so it's hard for people to pick up these specific recommendations that we've put forward because we haven't really got them out there yet. But I'm hoping that they will have some impact on people's thinking. And I guess particularly the importance of, I guess, trying to get down on the ground in more and support those long-term processes. Like it has been a real challenge to kind of, my experience in the last 5 or 10 years, just to get fire on the ground in some areas. That's been the biggest challenge. And once we've got fire on the ground, you come to the next question is, well, how do we continue to resource and grow that? And one of the significant, there's a few significant issues, but one is that there isn't a lot of resourcing of Indigenous-led land managers in the south. There's, you know, we've got sort of, you know, about a dozen or so kind of in the southeast anyway. Probably across the whole south, there's probably 20 or 30 sort of reasonably well-funded projects, you know, across a very large area. So more investment in the actual boots on the ground sort of stuff is really critical. But then I guess also being able to kind of bring, I guess, better processes around, like I said before, the monitoring, evaluation, like data sovereignty of groups to be able to kind of collect their own data, map their own country and start to kind of manage their own country so that you can actually start to get the cut through. Because a lot of the projects are constrained by resourcing and tenure, so people aren't able to sort of do what would make sense. They have to kind of do what they can only sort of do within a limited budget or a limited landscape. So being able to kind of broaden that out and better resource and better expand people's ability to get to the places they need to get to and have the resources to manage them. I think that's the key kind of learning that we need to take forward.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I see Sonia had her hand up. Sonia, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, listen, I actually just wanted to add to that because this work and the previous work is certainly informing what we're doing in work with Emergency Management Australia, who's soon to be part of the NRRA, on programs going forward. And we're certainly looking at that high degree of empowerment and self-determination in program design and so on that is currently under consideration. And a lot of the messages throughout this.
Yeah, and I guess I had to add to Son's point is that you know, there has been a lot of appetite and real a collaborative spirit, I guess, from agencies saying, look, we're really keen to see these recommendations. We're trying, but we're also keen to learn. So I guess for me, there's an absolute appetite to learn what's out there, and also just how to, you know, chip away so that we can, you know, address those short term with an eye on those longer term recommendation areas.
And if I could just say, yeah, there has been some great work done in the lead up to these bushfires as well, and coming through from some of the agencies. Like, you know, I guess it is a highly kind of conflicting space. You know, Aboriginal communities trying to, you know, access resources and maintain their rights, and it can be quite disjointed trying to engage with government. But there has been some good progress. You know, particularly, I guess, you know, in Victoria, the development of the traditional owner fire strategy and the commitment from the state to invest. Traditional owners were asking for more and would like more, and I think they deserve more. But positive step forward that there's a long-term commitment in Victoria. In New South Wales, equally, as an outcome of the New South Wales inquiry, there's a clear determination that we're talking about more than burning. We're talking about cultural land management, and we're not just talking about burning for bushfire management. We're talking about burning for country and a more holistic framework. And the state's committed to developing a program and a strategy. And so we're seeing some good progress. You know, there's a lot more that needs to be done. But, you know, having these conversations in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, there has been a lot more interest and growth, as you'd expect. But just, you know, seeing as well across, you know, in WA and South Australia and Tassie as well, Southeast Queensland, you know, policymakers are making decisions that are positive, and they're standing up and making, you know, I guess, progress. And I guess it's really important that we just kind of continue to collaborate and support each other to kind of learn from what's working on the ground under the aspirations of traditional owners and cultural land managers, and what's happening at different jurisdictions and how we can learn from each other. I think that's all we can do going forward.
Great. There's a question in the chat by Deborah. Deborah, if you want to just ask the question, or Ollie and Kathy could read the question, or I can read it out. Does this build on the National Bushfire Summit recommendations? And in your views, were the summit recs taken on board by relevant agencies and stakeholders?
Nice to hear from you, Deb. If I could, do you want to go first, Ollie, on this one, or?
You go.
So our brief really wasn't to test the recommendations and whether they were taken up, just to be clear. Our request was actually to go and ask those on the ground, you know, where their recommendations come from. So not to say these recommendations weren't relevant, we certainly reviewed them, but we were actually trying to get those recommendations from the ground up. I have to say, when you go through submissions, you do see the same names, which is lovely, and, you know, organisations who do very eloquent submissions, which is wonderful to review. We were keen to try and get those from, you know, from the ground. So all the recommendations that came out, all the submissions that provided recommendations were compiled and reviewed, and certainly were helpful. But we did certainly get most of our intel from those who, you know, who are actually on the ground.